I want to talk about this new warehouse scheme that many of the warehouses has going on. I am kind of new to warehouse work as of like 2018-19. But I want to tell my experience working at a warehouse in Perryville, Maryland. Many of the warehouses now require their employees to reach a quota, which I believe is just the easy way of removing employees for personal reasons and not because of work ethic. So I was hired on with IKEA. I was hired on with nine other people. We started June 21st in 2021. And I want to mention that I am a convicted felon. I have a conviction um, on my record. I was convicted in March of 2016. So it's been difficult for me to gain employment, especially since having a conviction on my record. Since the conviction, I have worked some jobs, and most of the jobs were on assignment through an agency until finally landing the job with IKEA. So, as I said, there were 10 of us. That includes myself that got hired on. By October, 4 months later, only myself and one other employee remained employed with IKEA from our group. One day, while parking our lifts, one of the guys from our group says, me and you are the only ones left. Majority of the group went to the CDC department, as you can see in the chart, and he was one of them. So if anyone knew who remained employed with IKEA, it would be him. So around the time when he told me this was during the shift bid, because I remember telling him that I would be switching to day shift. So this is how I know that they were going within 4 months. And who knows, maybe they all were not gone, but I do know for sure that six of our out of our group, out of the 10 was no longer employed with IKEA. IKEA was like a revolving door. They had a very high turnover rate. And one thing about me is I'm very good about showing up for work and doing my job. And one of their issues to keeping your job with IKEA was attendance. When I first started, I thought I would never get it. Packing the cargoes and using the system. I just thought they were going to get rid of me. But I managed and I made it through, the 90-day period. But before I went to day shift, I was given an evaluation of my performance, and I was low on my numbers. And the team leader asked if I would like to be retrained. So I opted to be retrained. So what the trainer did was he followed me throughout the shift to observe what I was doing. And so in the end, he says he didn't see anything that I was doing wrong and gave me a couple tips. One tip was not to clear the pallet if I'm not taking the last item, because there was always a sheet of cardboard covering the pallet. So whenever we went to a location to pick, um, the last item left, we would have to take the piece of cardboard and put it in the recycle bin located at the end of the aisle. Well, if I picked and there was one left, I would still pull the cardboard. So one of his tips was not to worry about removing the cardboard if there was an item left, because that takes time. So the other tip he gave was not to make a U-turn in the aisle. It's better to just go up and around because your picks more than likely will always be nearby in order. So he said, other than that, I was doing fine. He said he even saw me pack something that he didn't think was going to fit, but I managed to get it in. So I had the basics down to perform the job. He also told me to keep track of my downtime. So when I switched to day shift, the first time they called me into the office to have a conversation with me regarding my performance, and I was given the option to be retrained. But I declined the training since I had already been retrained on nights. And I remember when I was being retrained, one of my coworkers said to my trainer that he was surprised to see I was being retrained because I was always seen working. I wasn't a big chatter, although I talked with people, but not much. And so after this meeting and declining the training, that day, when I went back out on the floor to work, that day I had reached 180 and I had never reached that much. So I realized that I needed to spend less time trying to fit everything into the cargo. Because there were times I would take the items out to get it to fit. So when I spent less time rearranging, I reached the 180. So going down the line, um, I was called once again for corrective action. So they had three corrective action categories: attendance, performance, and safety. My corrective was performance. I worked building 3 or 4, and the goal for building 3 was 154 lines, and building 4 was 250 lines. In order to reach 154 lines, one would have to do at least 17 lines per hour. And for 250, at least 28 lines per hour in order to reach the goal by the end of the shift. I was receiving 6 to 10 lines per hour. It was not possible for me to reach the goal with such numbers, and they were fully aware. So I knew that reaching the goal of what they were expecting was beyond my control. I only had control of showing up to work on time and performing my job in a safe manner. But what I did not have control of was what came across my screen. And they were in full control of the number of lines we would receive. And leading up to my termination, um, they were doing all sorts of tactics to stop me from reaching the goal. So, what you see here um, in this chart is an example of what I was dealing with. Given, for example, given a box pick of 3 lines, and one of the lines I had to pick was 112 pieces, 5 pieces, and 22 pieces. Another pick I had was 5 lines, picking 22, 13, 58, and 7 pieces from different locations. They were doing all sorts of tactics to stop me from reaching the goal. I would go to locations and the labels would not be facing front to scan. Sometimes the items on the pallet were not unwrapped, so I would have to unwrap the pallet in order to get to the item, which consisted of removing plastic wrap, the straps, tape, and so on. So many of my locations, would be, like the last items picked. So I would have to remove the cardboard to place it in a recycle bin. I would have to search for needed items in order to do the pick. I was having issues with my computer on the lift. And so when I was called to the office again regarding my performance, my correction act, this is what the correction action stated, that as a whole, my performance showed lack of focus and unwillingness to achieve stated goals, resulting in not getting customer orders to the outbound doors, and in addition, cause undue burden to the other coworkers to still achieve the goals and completing customer orders. There were times that I would notice my completed picks still sitting in the aisles, which was the responsibility of outbound, but it seemed they were placing the blame on me. There were many changes happening, to the process. For example, we had to pick from the second level, and from the time when I first started, we always picked from the lower level. So they started to have plockers um, pick from the second tier. But I believe it was really meant just for me. But they wanted to make it seem as though all plockers were picking from the second tier. One day I was assigned an unusual 30 lines for a pick. And the weight for this pick was 405 pounds. And the volume was 825. And so for this pick, one of my lines I had to pick from the second tier. And I had already had picked a majority of the lines, of the 30 lines. So the weight was heavy. So as I rose my lift to grab the pick from the second level, it was very unstable and wobbling. So as I was trying to grab the item, they were stuck together. And so being up so high and not being able to just grab the item, I didn't feel safe, so I just lowered myself down. So IKEA expected their workers to be responsible for the general safety. And this was their general policy. was to maintain a safe work environment at all times, observe and practice all safety procedures established by IKEA, take reasonable care to protect the health and safety of themselves and of other coworkers, never perform work that he or she believes is unsafe or that he or she thinks is likely to cause injury or health risk to themselves or others, not operate any equipment without proper instructions or training, and keep all work areas clean and free from clutter or debris. Well, so much for this policy since I was being placed in harm's way by having me pick from the second tier, with that amount of weight. And on top of that, not being able to grab the item due to them being stuck together. So one day, I'm riding my lift down the aisle, and it looked as if someone had threw a lot of corners in the middle of the aisle. And one of the team leaders was standing nearby talking with someone. So sometimes those corners are known, they can get stuck under your lift. So I got off to pick them up because I didn't want to drive over them. But I believe they were intentionally placed there with the hope that I would drive over them and they could give me points or maybe cause to terminate my position immediately. Also, I was being assigned box picks that were impossible to fit into the cargo. Now, no matter how I arranged it, no matter which way you position, it was just not going to fit. And I was stopped from being able to transfer my picks to a B pallet, which was another issue that stopped me from reaching my performance goal. I was the only plocker with the issue of transferring to a B pallet. And this issue um, had started in May and continued up to my termination. And it was brought to their attention, and the issue was never fixed. And I could just go on and on with the different tactics they did in the attempt to end my job. And there were times that I would come into work and my car key would not work. But because I was coming in with other workers, they would use their card key and it would work. And there were times that I would leave out for my lunch break and I would come to get back into the building and still my card key would not work. But someone else's would work. And, the sad thing about the loss of my job is workers were in on it. It was like a whole team. People pretending to be cool with you, smiling in your face, and at the same time scheming to place you out of a job. When I was terminated, I was never reached out by the chief shop steward, because this job was union. And as I was told, you know, which was, confirmation that they planned to end my position, because I was told that I would be contacted. And I was never, contacted. So, but one of my coworkers from night shifts noticed I wasn't around and gave me a call. So I told him, I was terminated, and I told him a little of what had been going on. And maybe he might have known what was going on. But he had told me, he said, call Garrett, who was the chief shop steward. Um and so I was like, I didn't want to call him. I was telling him, I was like, I really don't want to call him. But he said, he was like, look, you need your job, which was true. I did need my job. So I called him and got no answer. And his mailbox was full. So I couldn't even leave him a message. So I don't know how it is that someone in his position doesn't make sure, he's available. And I never received a return phone call, nor did I receive, a call from him as I was told. So when I was walked out the IKEA doors, I was told then that I would get a call from the union rep, which by him not calling, that to me was confirmation that it was planned, for them to end my position. So some might would say, why didn't I, just look for something else? And I didn't look for something else because whatever the reason IKEA chose to terminate my position, the next place I worked would be the same. Because I know for a fact that it was not my job performance. I was pretty much set up. Like I said, I could control showing up for work and being safe, but I did not have control of my performance on the job. It's like telling a delivery driver, you have to deliver 500 packages per week, but the company only gives you half of the amount and holds you accountable for something you have no control over. So it seems, I have been just dealing with being a target in the workplace since my conviction and job with the University of Delaware. So I'm telling this story to give people a heads up of how your employer can set you up to fail and not be held accountable. Because I had filed a lawsuit against IKEA for wrongful termination, and the motion to dismiss was granted. So that's it. The law says it's okay for your employer to place you out of a job. You know, so what it said in the conclusion is said, employers as well as employees may terminate an employee relationship for almost any reason, including reasons that may seem unfair. I had posted a video of a clip from a 2020 episode. It was titled Workplace Confidential. And Cynthia Shapiro was speaking out on the things employers will do to place a worker out of a job. And this aired in 2011. And it's still going on today. The laws just make no sense um, to allow someone to tamper with the system to make it look as though you're not performing your job. And this is exactly what was done to me. So, I could handle the job and the work. The work was not hard. But like I said, the law says it's okay for them to place me out of a job, taking away my livelihood. Loss of my health benefits, my apartment, my credit is poor with owed debt because of the job loss. And this also affects my son too. So, but I will say this, that the loss of this job has taught me many things that I will be speaking about. But I want everyone to know how I was treated, not just by IKEA, but other places of employment. And to basically, I just want to make people aware, who work in warehouses. And not just warehouses. I mean, you can be set up in any job. So as far as I'm concerned, it's just, this quota game is just a sneaky way for employers to remove employees for no good reason. And, I'm just here, creating this YouTube channel to call out, or call out employers and speak on, many other issues. So that's all for this one. So, I've more to say, but I'm going to cut this one short for now. So please, come back. All right, that's all.